like our psyche is just trying to keep us safe. These are survival mechanisms of our nervous system to make us feel safe, to make us feel we can cope with this world and with our relationships. Welcome to the Shift Within podcast. I'm your host, Alice. I'm from the Inner Shift Institute, and I'm here to guide you on a journey inside of your mind. Our podcast is a platform for catalyzing both inner and outer shifts using the power of psychedelics and powerful therapeutic tools. Welcome to your new beginning. Welcome to your new life. Welcome to The Shift Within, our podcast exploring the mysteries of the subconscious mind, the body-mind connection, and all things psychedelics. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Stephanie Mitchel, and she is a level 3 certified IFS therapist from Australia. She focuses on complex trauma, dissociation, and experiences often labeled as psychosis. Welcome to our podcast, Stephanie. Thank you so much for being here. In our podcast, we often discuss psychedelics, and the topic of psychosis comes up really frequently. And this is also how I got in touch with you. I was researching about psychosis. Before we go into the topic of psychedelics, I would just really love to know a little bit more about you. Like, how did you get into working with complex trauma and specifically with psychosis, and how long have you been doing this?
I've been doing it quite some time. I think 2012, so about 12 years. I homeschooled my children for a lot of years. And then when I went back to work, I went back as a mental health peer worker. And then I trained as a therapist after that. But when I was working in peer work and then mental health services support work and then eventually in as a therapist, I was working in a space where there was a lot of people who end up in mental health services for various diagnoses, like, people who get diagnosed schizophrenic or psychotic or bipolar or borderline personality disorder, which I don't really, I don't adhere to labels, and I don't follow kind of like diagnostic categories in those ways, but those were the people that I was working with. As I was doing that work, what I was finding was that the way people were treated was really not particularly humane. There was no space for the person. It was all about the diagnosis, and I was really angry, actually. My own trauma from my childhood was about being misunderstood and not seen and perceived in certain ways that weren't accurate to who I was as a person, and so I saw that wherever I went in the mental health service. And so I became quite involved in the psychiatric survivor movement because I deeply identified with people going through struggle who were being mistaken around who they are as a person. And so then when I first started working as a therapist, I also worked for an organisation. I was fortunate enough to work for a non-government organisation that specialised in working with people interfacing with mental health services. And so my very first, I suppose, exposure to working with clients with people hearing voices. I ran a hearing voices group for a number of years, co-led it with another couple of facilitators, and I had some really good supervision. So for me, the important thing was that, I was really nurtured through that. We kind of think of new therapists, you give them the easy clients and these are the supposed hard clients, but it wasn't really like that. It was just like you learn when you're sitting opposite somebody about what they need, and there's no difference between someone who's hearing voices and somebody who's having a bit of anxiety, in my opinion. So that's how I got into it.
And from all this time that you've been working with people who have been labeled to have a psychosis, what would you say is the most common misperception that we have about psychosis or like bipolar or schizophrenia?
One of the top perceptions is that it's a brain disorder and that someone is unwell for life, and they will cycle in and out of unwellness forever, be in and out of psychiatric hospital, won't be able to maintain a job or get married or have children. That's actually something that psychiatrists actually tell people. Maybe not on their first episode of psychosis, but eventually, after a few admissions, there's a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar or whatever it is, and they get told these kinds of things. It's pretty ubiquitous in the psychiatric survivor movement to hear story after story after story of people being told, expect to live on disability the rest of your life and don't have a job and don't have a family. I think one of the other problems is that it's indecipherable because it's a brain disorder, so how can it make sense? Whereas what we do know is that it absolutely makes sense, and that if we listen to people's experience, that they let us know why they're having these experiences of voices and hallucinations of various kinds, like tactile, for instance. And it's a fine line, in my opinion, between a PTSD flashback and a tactile hallucination. People can get really misdiagnosed. Also sometimes, and then there's, sorry, I'm getting down a rabbit hole I can feel now, but I want to slow down a second and just say that there's a sort of difference between, obviously a PTSD flashback is contextual to an actual event, right? Whereas someone might have a sense of feeling something crawling in their skin or someone touching them that is just deemed to be a hallucination. And what I would say is, if it's not autobiographical, then it has some other important meaning to it. And so that's where probably the difference is between a typical PTSD flashback that's physically felt in the body or seen or heard, and something that gets called hallucination but is actually, in my mind, a part doing that to convey a really important message. There are other misperceptions. A lot of these people are extremely vulnerable and have had a lot of power used in ways that used against them, basically. But the media would like us to think that people are dangerous and things like that. And I think that's a big misperception. Yeah. I think there's one more misperception that feels important to me and tricky, because even in the IFS community there's some idea of like biological hereditary factors, but there's just no evidence to biological or hereditary factors. Does it run in families? Yes. Has anyone been able to test or do a research study that accounts for familial patterns, ways of communicating, the nurture side of the equation? No. And so my difficulty is that there's also some pretty good research that says when we see someone as other and they're different to us and we're sane and they're insane, which is what the biological framework actually kind of makes someone othered. Even though we kind of think it would create a lot more compassion, like this poor person has a brain disorder, that's not actually how it works out. The research, there's a couple of research, they're only small studies, but they're studies that show that mental health professionals, when they have that frame of reference, tend to dehumanize other and not see the person as like them, as opposed to this person's had trauma or suffering or some sort of adversity makes a connection between me and them, and therefore I can treat them more humanely. So that's one of my big difficulties in saying it's hereditary. Is there's no research or evidence. They've been trying to find the DNA sequence of schizophrenia for 50 years and they've not found anything. And then the other thing is that we have to be careful about how we view people, and psychiatry does dehumanize people quite a lot, actually.
It's really sad when that happens. And I mean, if a person comes to a psychiatrist looking for help and then they're being told, you have a problem, you have a brain disorder, there's nothing we can do to fix it, well, then of course this person will automatically not open up to the ways that, like the possibilities that we can actually heal it. But you have told me that you have actually worked with people and you were able to significantly improve or even heal psychosis. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe also give us an example of what could be behind a psychosis, what could be a possible factor that creates psychosis in people?
Yeah. So I'm glad you raised about people getting well, because that's pretty normal, actually. So I'll speak to that bit first, and then I'll speak to what might be behind something. That's a really big question. So the first question around people getting well, there's some pretty good evidence internationally that people get well. There's also really good evidence through, if people want to look up resources, Madness Radio is an excellent resource, and it's very easy to listen to because it's a podcast. And it's interviews with hundreds of people who have gotten well and are no longer on medication. And that's not to say that sometimes medication, it might be part of someone's path, an important part for a lot of people, but they can get to a point where they may not need it. So, I'm currently working with a gentleman. I've been with him for a couple of years, and he's now tapering off his medication. And where the work is becoming much more productive. He's really facing some important things. But what has been incredibly powerful to me is the more relational safety that he finds in the therapeutic space with me, and the more we can start to invite his parts to think about the challenging beliefs he's had in the past, things that were challenging for him, not for me, things that he was having trouble, like, I believe this, but it's unbearable to believe it kind of stuff. And then another part who says, that's not true. As we've kind of sifted through that, he's just started becoming much more assertive. And one of the important things about people who have experiences that get called psychosis is they have a sense of feeling powerless. That seems to be a pretty common theme throughout everyone. And if you look at the power, threat, meaning framework, that's a body of work that was researched over about 5 years. Lucy Johnson and a bunch of other researchers did that piece of work. And you can read, there's like the 400-page document, and there's a shorter version that's about 130 pages. They have a great synopsis of that sense of powerlessness that people are speaking about. Does that feel like it answers the first part of your question? Because I'm going to pivot over to this other part.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. That okay. Explains it very well. So the second part of the question was, what would you say is the root cause for the people that you work with that share this psychosis, that like the mania, the schizophrenia?
Yeah. So I want to say there's a couple of different things. First of all, I want to say we don't really fully know. We make guesses. And the people who really know are the ones who have the lived experience of that. In my opinion, that I have to trust that my client's knowing is way more important than my knowing. But I do come with my own framework. And that framework's partly based on reading a lot of research and books, and partly sitting with people. So this is, I suppose, my idea of how psychosis arises. Different people have different points of view. Some people view it as a spiritual emergence. Some people believe it's a response to trauma, just a trauma response. There's some good stuff around Bateson's double bind theory of schizophrenia. If we leave aside some of the really negative stuff that was extrapolated from that back in the 60s that kind of made it the parents are the problem, if we leave that aside and don't kind of get into saying the etiology of psychosis is in the parents and all of that. But we do take what is helpful from Bateson, which is to notice patterns of communication, where maybe an anxious parent communicated something to a very sensitive child, and the child learnt not to know certain things. I think that's really valuable, and that's one of the things that I hold when I'm working with people, is listening for the early beliefs that came about through communication patterns in the family of origin and or school, social settings, things like that. There's some good evidence around just trauma. People who have been, say, sexually abused and have to not know about the abuse, or not know their own vulnerability. People who are bullied at school often start to hear voices. People going to university, that can be kind of like the first time the voices come. But when you really get to listen, it's because of an earlier trauma or an earlier difficulty, or being under-resourced or feeling powerless in other areas. So that's kind of like the meta, right? And then the thing that I want to speak for is that my view, essentially someone coming in to see me, I am listening for a bunch of things. I am listening for something, some trigger, some stressful event in this person's life triggered an old coping strategy that used to work and no longer works. When that stops working, something else starts to kind of emerge. And the same is true for all of us. And this is where someone who's having those experiences that get called psychosis is no different to any of us, right? It just has a different flavor to it. So we all have, if you get sexually abused as a child, for instance, and you grow up and you don't want to know that, and then when you get to a certain age, you get really badly triggered by something, and all of a sudden you start to have memories, okay? Then we would call that something different to psychosis. But a person who's going through psychosis may have the same thing. The memories are coming through, but they're coming through as a voice communicating something, and then other parts are really afraid of that. So that's really, for me, how something's coming through that one part wants to be known, and something's coming through that, and another part doesn't want that to be known. So here's something got triggered. I used to be able to, this part here who's the protector, used to be able to kind of keep that down. I can't keep it down anymore, so it's here more. But I'm so committed to not knowing, because it was really important for my survival to not know for myself or anyone else to notice, that this part tries to stop that being known. And the one who wants it known communicates it through metaphor. And I haven't fully yet, this is total hypothesis now, I believe that in some ways, even the exile who's wanting it to be known knows it's dangerous for it to be known. So even it's kind of like an agreement inside. This one says, we don't want to have the other person know. And this one says, I need it to be known, but I'm also scared. So let's communicate it through some language or form that will check if the other person's safe enough to hear it and hold it. Because if I say straightforward, whatever the thing is, I might get hurt, rejected, judged. The person might use power against me, basically. Whereas if I code it in a way, and I'm using the term metaphoric language, then I create a sense of maybe the other person will hear. So that's one piece, the person hearing. But there's also the piece about me hearing, if I'm the client. And I did a supervision today with a woman who's working with a client who hears voices. And this client beautifully, when you create enough trust, the client starts to tell you things that they themselves aren't even fully aware of until they're kind of like saying it. And this client had said to her, hey, it's easier for me to think that all these really terrible things are outside of myself than it is for me to think they're in me. And so that little phrase is a key to us about, I think that's really common across the board. I'm not saying it's universal. I was about to, and then I went, well, that's not true. Every person's having a different experience. But it's very, very common that there's a disowned, not me sense in the person. There are things in me that cannot be part of me. And whether it's my vulnerability and my fear, whether it's my sense of I'm a bad person, or whether it's my sense of I'm a good person, but there are things that cannot be known about me by me. And so I'm desperately trying to convey that to someone safe enough who will help me titrate towards knowing and not knowing. So my work is listening for what's being communicated before this one suppresses. So this one comes up and says something before this one shuts it down. And then I'll reflect that back. And oftentimes I'll get this one saying, no, that's not right. And I'll go, that's okay. Within a period of time, this one's again saying, here it is again. And I'm going, I hear you and I see you. And is this one available to also allow a little bit of space or not? And that's the entire piece of the work.
It's super fascinating. And for me, I have experience with parts work and internal family systems, but I just want to explain a little bit for the listeners who have no idea what that means. Is in IFS and parts work, there's this concept around we have different parts within ourselves. And you were mentioning the exiles. This is what, these are the hurt parts within ourselves that were hurt when oftentimes when when we were children. And then we have the protector parts that we have created in these moments of trauma to protect our psyche from, to protect it in a way that we could actually deal with it, because maybe we were abused and we were not able to tell anybody. So we create a protector part in our psyche that will protect us from going to the hurt that the abuse or trauma created in us. And so that's what I'm hearing you talk about, is that people that have a psychosis, they have different parts within themselves that are, like conflicted with each other. And you're helping the people to, bring clarity into this process and to hear each part out. I guess that you're understood from the work as a therapist with people with psychosis, that all of the people that you have worked with have had some actual trauma happen to them that has caused their internal system, maybe to get conflicted or confused. And that's their way of communicating, like different parts trying to communicate other things within their system. And that can, of course, create a lot of confusion in the person. Is that correct? Did I understand that right?
Yeah, I like to think of it more of as a polarization. I think that it looks confusing to the outsider, and it is confusing to the person who's having all these conflicting experiences. But I don't like to think of my clients as confused. I like to think of them as actually being quite clear. And one of the things that I love about Ronald Lang and other people like Matthew Ball is they talk about the fact that psychosis is just transient, okay? You can have a person who's talking to you. I can have a person talking to me who's very, very lucid and clear and very knows what they're saying, and I'm right with them and I get it. And then something happens where it feels unsafe all of a sudden, and they're saying things that are a little bit tangential, and I lose them, and they lose me. I'm like, I have no idea what they're talking about right at the moment. And for me, that is nothing more than a sign that something felt unsafe, and that what Matt Ball who is a therapist in Adelaide at the Humane Clinic, he says it's almost like the psychosis gets put between me, the therapist, and the client puts it between me and them so that it feels a bit safer, because something got really confronting and I can't know this not knowing. I can't know what has to be disowned inside of me at the moment. And there is Moskowitz and some other researchers are talking a little bit about whether there's for some clients, not all clients, there's some disorganized attachment in there. And I heard someone say that they were really offended by that idea, someone in the Hearing Voices movement. And I want to say that for me, I definitely have young parts who had a really disorganized experience of my parents, very disorganized. And so I have very young parts who have a disorganized attachment, and I have other parts who have an avoidant attachment and other parts who have an anxious attachment. And so there's no negative connotations about disorganized attachment in my system. And I don't see my clients in that way at all. What I know about attachment theory is that it's about the relational space when you're a child, and it's not static. But it does make sense to me that there's sort of, for some clients, a push-pull around, can I trust you, and I want to, and I'm drawn towards you, and I also am terrified of you, which is a trait, one trait of people who have some level of disorganized attachment. And I see that with my clients, where all clients need us to move towards and away from as therapists, but particularly it takes a very fine-tuned skill and to listen to the themes, to know what you're sort of listening to as the therapist. And it's easy to learn. So when I say it's fine-tuned, I don't want anyone to be put off working with people who are hearing voices or having tactile hallucinations or whatever, because it's quite easy to learn how to be that fine-tuned. And IFS is really the perfect modality as well. We are constantly taught to be very fine-tuned to our clients and adaptive and moving, what my friend David Stone calls being nimble dance partners.
And what would you say, like when we move over to the field of psychedelic therapy, there is this common belief that people who have a family history of psychosis, they shouldn't do psychedelic therapy, that a psychedelic session could trigger a psychosis in them. Like, having all the knowledge that you have, and I know that you also have some knowledge about psychedelics, what would you say to that? Do you believe people that have a family history of psychosis shouldn't do psychedelic therapy? Or it's like, would the modality IFS be better for them to work on their things? Or is it actually good if the psychedelic experience brings up these parts so then they can work on them and really resolve?
Well, there's a couple of things. I have so many things to say about that. There's a guy called Benjamin Mudge, I think is his name, who's doing some work on ayahuasca for bipolar. And I'm curious why he chose ayahuasca, but I don't fully understand all of his research. I watched a bunch of his videos. And he has bipolar, and he's doing some great stuff, and I'm really excited for his work. Bipolar is one set of protectors in my mind. It's like the protector who keeps you away from the pain inside of you through like mania and excitement and, you know, chasing that. And then obviously when you can't keep away from the pain because the wounded parts, what we call exiles, keep coming up, you end up falling into a bit of a heap. Plus you can't keep that level of adrenaline going all the time, so you end up depressed. And it's both sides are a call towards something that needs tending. So I just thought I'd pop that in there, that for me it's no different. Bipolar is not that much different to any other form of what gets called psychosis. It's a different presentation. But as far as psychedelics, apparently there are also people using ketamine-assisted therapy for bipolar. And so that is not something that's excluded with ketamine. I don't know anything about it. I don't do it myself, but I've heard that that's a thing. I had a friend who was allowed into clinical, it wasn't a clinical trial, but it was a program that was after a clinical trial that was run by the S-ketamine, people who do S-ketamine work. He was told he could join that. So obviously, and that was a psychiatrist and the clinic and Johnson & Johnson. So that's who have patented S-ketamine. So there's kind of that piece. As far as family history, I personally wouldn't screen someone who had a family history of psychosis. Now, if they had a personal history of psychosis, yes, I would be concerned. I would be wanting to check with them. I would be wanting to do a lot of preparation work beforehand. I would be wanting to do a lot of work on their old psychotic experience. If they're no longer psychotic, what happened back then? And they need to have a place where they understand why the earlier psychedelics triggered their psychosis, or if it wasn't psychedelics that triggered psychosis, what did? But I wouldn't be taking them on a psychedelic journey anytime soon, put it that way. Most people who have family histories, if they're people who are willing to look at their... It's like if I was checking with someone, I'd be checking for, does this person have a flavour of, I have to disown parts of myself? So if they have a family history of that, and I'm getting to know their system, and I'm going, there is a lot of obfuscation is what I call it. There is a lot of obfuscation in this person's system. Then I'd probably be pretty reticent to have them have certain types of psychedelics. I don't know about ketamine. The jury's out for me on that, but it would be something I'd want to think about it down the track. Having said that, I will say I've met people who've done psychedelics, including IFS people, who have had a psychotic experience, and everything ranging from very, very short, 2 days afterwards, being absolutely terrified, quite paranoid, and then becoming fine again. And then spending some time integrating that experience, right? And finding out why their parts had done that, what their parts were trying to tell them, and that wasn't a traumatic experience because that person has come out the other side and they found out why their parts did that. I've also worked with people who haven't been in IFS prior to psychedelics who became psychotic. And those people, when we've unpacked it, there was a very specific reason. It was, I have a conflict and internal conflict about a situation in my life, and I feel tied to whatever that conflicted situation is, can't get away from it or can't leave because some part feels afraid. And then the psychedelics bring up something that says the opposite. You have to leave, you must leave, something like that. I had one client, this person had been in a relationship, and she started hearing a voice that she was a lesbian, and after the psychedelics that she took, and she was very afraid, and she was in a relationship that she wasn't happy with at the time. And there's more information that I won't go into, but just to say that it was really disturbing to her that she might be a lesbian because of her faith. And anyway, eventually the voice that was telling her you're a lesbian was kind of went on for years and years. And eventually, about a decade afterwards, she came to see me and said, I have this voice who says I'm a lesbian, and it came up after that psychedelic, but it's never really gone away. And as we unpacked it, it wasn't just as easy as like asking the voice why it says that, because it was sort of became apparent that she didn't necessarily have access to that. So in the end, what we did do was like we talked about how it came about, what was happening in her life at the time. Was she was telling me, well, I was with my boyfriend and I was in this job and blah, blah, blah. And as we unpacked it, I was saying, did you like your job? Yes, you did. Okay. How was it being with your boyfriend? Well, I wasn't really that happy with him. Okay, well, tell me more about that. Why didn't you leave? And what was difficult? And some things came up about, because she was unhappy with him, she didn't really want to be sexual, but she also was, like going along because she also didn't want to create ripples. And so there was like layers of things in there, right? Around her sexuality, around being in a relationship. And I just said to her, well, that seems like an important part of all of this. I wonder if we could get to listen to that voice. And as we did eventually, after there was enough safety, we did start to listen to that voice. And there was two things. There was an earlier experience from her childhood, sexuality. It wasn't sexual abuse. It was just about sexuality. And then there was a later piece, obviously, in this relationship. What came out in the kind of, as we unpacked it, was that the voice actually would say to her in her current relationship with her husband, any time that they would have an argument, her husband and her now, in the new relationship, not that she left the old relationship, it would say, you're a lesbian, because it actually would like her to leave the relationship because she didn't feel like maybe she had a voice. So essentially what happened was we unpacked that the earlier time with the relationship she was unhappy with was an attempt to get her out of the relationship, and the voice is almost completely silent now, except for when things feel bad and she is also feeling, I can't speak up to my now husband. So it was a great little like barometer for her. Every time she was maybe having a caretaking part running her life in the relationship, this voice would come and she could turn and say, what do you need from me? And it might be, I need you to speak up for me more. So can you see that, like, it's not, the psychosis isn't a problem, it's a message. And whether the person had a short episode psychosis, whether they heard voices that linger, whether they hear it ongoing, we can kind of find out what it is. And as far as the medicine creating that and it being a family thing, like, I would just know that I can hold someone out the other side of that. I can hold them through the meaning-making process about why it came up. Not that I would be wanting to throw people in the deep end, like I said earlier. If someone has had a history of psychosis, I probably wouldn't be suggesting psychedelics anytime soon. So does that help?
Yes, definitely.
It's a very robust. I know I've just given a very long explanation.
No, but it's fascinating, and it also really aligns with like how we think about anything that is related to mental health, and that there's always a reason. There's always our system is trying to cope in some ways with an experience from the past or with a current experience, and sometimes that seems, it seems like there is actually a problem to the outside, but actually there's intelligence in the symptom. There's intelligence
Yes.
in our coping strategies. And so I really love hearing the examples that you're giving and what you found out was underneath it. And that just explains so well. Like our psyche is just trying to keep us safe. These are survival mechanisms of our nervous system to make us feel safe, to make us feel we can cope with this world and with our relationships, right? So it's really fascinating to talk about this and to hear about your experiences. And can you tell us a little bit about the research that you're going to do? Because I think that's really fascinating. If the things that we're talking about can actually be researched and that we can have some proper studies that show that there is something to what we're saying here.
Yeah, so the research it's going to be a qualitative research, and it'll be interviewing people who self-identify as having some form of experience that gets classified psychotic. And it'll be asking those people about how IFS has helped them. And so it's people who've had IFS. So the research is specifically IFS for psychosis. And it will be asking people, how has IFS helped you differently than other things maybe you had tried prior? And then we'll also be interviewing therapists and asking, how are you adapting IFS to working with this population? What things have you found worked and what things have you found don't work? And kind of putting all of that together, because the reason that I wanted to do this research, so I pretty much designed the study, and Ian Whitmarsh, who's the lead investigator, we sat down together and we talked about what we wanted, and he kind of let me take the lead about what I wanted. And so we've designed this beautiful, he's a very, very skilled researcher already, and we've designed this beautiful study because what my goal is to really provide a resource to IFS therapists so that they're not, it seems, I think people think it's hard or sort of like somehow a mystery, and I just want to demystify the whole thing. And there's no one right way, but, I work in a particular way. I did probably, not quite a decade of work in the Hearing Voices movement, maybe about 7 years in the Hearing Voices movement, and just never felt it was enough. I was just always very frustrated about it, feeling like there was more that I wanted to offer my clients than just a little bit of understanding or a little bit of coping strategies or a little bit of community or a lot of community. Like I wanted my young parts who have a lot of wounding around my trauma want full healing. And so I felt that I wanted to offer that for my clients. And so for me, I have a very particular approach that's informed by the Hearing Voices community and my work there. It's informed by the Power Threat Meaning framework. It's informed by Matthew Ball at the Humane Clinic, who was one of my early mentors. And it's informed by Moskowitz and Bateson and my early work in psychodynamic work. But not all IFS therapists come with that heritage. They come with all kinds of things. So I really want to get a lovely resource together of all the voices of the clients. These are the things that helped us, and these are the things, don't do that. I want to hear from people when IFS therapists have done X, Y, and Z, that did not work. So let's not do that.
Thank you for doing this putting this amazing resource together. I'm going to be super interested to know once it's ready and to hear more about it. What would you say to somebody if somebody's going through a psychedelic experience and they are in the psychedelic experience experiencing something similar to or something that we would label psychosis? Yeah. How should the therapist best handle that?
That's a really good question. I don't actually currently work with people doing psychedelic work. I only do preparation and integration. So I'm going to speak from a place of not actually having done that, but what I do know is through my own psychedelic work as a client, I have been very terrified sometimes. And what's helped me is knowing it's the medicine. So there's sort of a way that I have been able to sort of feel my own self energy. And if the person who helped, when I've had psychedelic work, it's been with someone very experienced who's prepared me for things that might feel difficult. And so because I knew this might become really painfully difficult, terrifyingly difficult at times, I might think I'm going to die. I might think demons are coming or something, right? Then when I'm in it, I can let myself feel it and also have moments where I'm like, this is the medicine. Or I can, as a sitter, I'm imagining I might say, I'm here with you. The medicine's trying to tell you something. It's just the medicine. We'll come out the other side of this. It's okay. And really, I'm not going to say much more than that because it's not up to me to interpret or try and help the person. They're going through something that's, psychedelics are a non-specific amplifier, right? It's amplifying something that needs to be known. And we don't know what it is.
Yes.
And the person, what I love about IFS is we follow the person. We never reframing someone's experience, like turning from you thinking of it this way, how about you think of it? We just don't do that in IFS ever, psychedelic or not, right? We follow the person's experience. And so even more important in the psychedelic journey.
Yes. And that's how what we also do when people get into psychosis, like states, when we guide them through psychedelic experiences, we really make sure that they feel emotionally safe so that they can move through whatever is coming up and surrender to anything that they're feeling in the moment, even the fear, even the wish for it to stop, to make everything okay, to make everything feel safe so that they can move through it and get the insights that they need. And I've had a podcast recording here a few weeks back with somebody who came to our retreat in last May. And she was going through a psychedelic experience and felt something that felt like a psychosis. She thought she was dying, couldn't communicate to any of the facilitators what was going on. They would come and check on her, but she just kept thinking they don't know that I'm dying and nobody can help me. And the next day we found out that this was actually an experience she had when she was a teenager. That's right. This was just a repetition of the same experience because she had high fever as a teenager. Nobody could help her for weeks, and she thought every night that she was going to go asleep, that she was going to die. And so the psychedelic experience brought it up, and in that moment she was scared that she was going to go crazy and this was going to stay forever. But in the end, we found out what the psychedelic experience was bringing up, what did it want to show her, and then we could use that to work through that experience that she has had as a teenager, and since then she feels so much better than before. So it was a really challenging journey. It was a lot that came up, but yeah, if we as facilitators, psychedelic facilitators, can make the people feel safe, and I think you're agreeing to that, then that can just bring up anything that needs to come up that for us to look at. There's Stan Grof, who's a pioneer in psychedelic therapy work. He has a theory that he says there's a difference between a spiritual emergency and psychosis and a psychedelic experience. And when I was speaking to you, you said you don't agree with that. Can you tell me what your point of view is on that?
So Stan Grof, his wife had a psychotic experience, right? And so it was kind of part of what he wanted in order to find a way to frame that other than being psychotic. And of course, she did come out the other side with a lot of support. And so he kind of made this differential diagnosis where some people are having a spiritual emergence and some people are having a legitimate psychosis. I don't really believe that there is a differentiation at all. The people that I know who've been through spiritual emergence have exactly the same flavor of experience. They're people who are having a conflict, something's arising, it's painful, it's difficult, it's overwhelming, they don't want to feel it or know it. And so it's like, this is here, I'm emerging into it, and this part doesn't want it to be here. And I don't know if there's always trauma attached with spiritual emergence, but I speak to people I've never had a spiritual emergence in the kind of like way that some people talk about it. And, you know, I've heard people talk more about sort of like a longer spiritual emergence as opposed to a spiritual emergency. I've definitely had the experience of a longer spiritual emergence into something, but the spiritual emergency I haven't had. And the people who talk about that say that a lot of it is not wanting to face some trauma, some pain, something that's underneath. It's like you kind of have your whole sense of what you thought life was blown out of the water, right? I don't think that's any different with the psychotic, quote unquote, psychotic person. And I don't understand how maybe the people who are going through a spiritual emergence are more aware of the spiritual connection, and that's how they came to view it that way. Maybe they got resourced by somebody saying, you're having a spiritual emergency. And so they ended up being able to frame it that way, whereas the person who's psychotic ends up in health service and framed in a different way. Or, I mean, people, I'll just acknowledge there are people who go through spiritual emergence who do first of all end up in health services before they end up maybe in the community of spiritual emergence people. So they're not exclusively only having interface with that group. But for me, it doesn't make any sense. I can't get my head around, like almost how it feels to me is that, you know, and I'm aware that since Dan Groff made that differentiation, and, you know, he's a psychiatrist, right? So in some ways it's within his purview to think in that way. People are having psychosis and are schizophrenic, and then there are these other experiences that look like that are a spiritual emergency and not rock the boat of his own establishment. You know, he's a psychiatrist. He's, you know, I'm not saying he did that for that reason. I'm making a guess, right? But the whole thing of like, it doesn't feel good to kind of really stand up against your own people and say there's no such thing as psychosis. So he probably does view that there's a difference. I'm not saying he didn't do it for that reason, but I'm just saying that things can stay outside of our awareness when, you know, we're constrained by our own conditioning. And so, which is why I'm always talking about, you know, my bias as an IFS therapist is totally because of my background, right? The way that I do things is because I'm influenced by certain experiences. So I wonder, so there's the, Stan Groff kind of had that whole, what's the name of his group he kind of started? I can't think what, it's not the Human Potential Movement, it's process work, but there's another name for it that I can't think of right off the top of my head. But those folks do think of psychosis over here, spiritual emergence over here, right? So it's a very kind of like, I've met people doing holotropic breath work and things like that do differentiate it. And for me, I just don't. People get well, they're going through a crisis, whether you call it a spiritual emergence, existential crisis, whatever you call it, people come out the other side and can get well. I think there are some people who don't get well, you know, even things like open dialogue that have an enormously high success rate, seem to find that some people don't. And I don't know why that is. A very small proportion, by the way, very small. Like 15%, I think I saw some research about a decade ago with open dialogue. 15% of people who come through open dialogue in Finland, 85% never have a second episode of psychosis, and there's 15% who do. And I'd be curious to do another study finding out the 15%, how many of those eventually do kind of get there. And, you know, research is tricky too because, you know, it's short term. What about longitudinal studies, right?
Yes.
Anyway, that track someone at the beginning of, say, open dialogue or IFS work and then follow them over a period of time where they really, you know, stay with the process. So, but I think there are people who, for various reasons, don't come out the other side of experiences, and we can make up stories about why that might be, but it's not as many as our society kind of believes, right? We treat everyone the same.
Yes.
Give them meds, tell them that they're broken, they've got a brain problem, it's in their family. And it's like, well, no, actually. And for a long time, you know, things like syphilis and there's some other brain conditions that they've also thought were psychosis that have now been proved to cause those kinds of symptoms. And we were wrong. And I just think that we're going to slowly find out that we're wrong in a lot of places. around psychosis. Yeah.
Yes. And that's a wonderful last thing to say. I believe there's so much potential to find out more, to learn more, and to evolve as humans, and also in our understanding about mental health. Right. So I'm really, really happy about the conversation that we had, and for you sharing about your experiences, about psychosis, about your point of view, and the research that you're doing that I'm very looking forward to. And thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It was really interesting.
Thank you so much, Alice. It was a real joy for me to be here.
And to our listeners out there, if you would like to learn more about Stephanie, we're going to put her website in the description of this podcast, so you can learn more about her work with IFS and also the study that she is involved in. And if you enjoyed today's episode and you want to stay connected with us, then please make sure to follow us on social media. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok under the Inner Shift Institute. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more interesting conversation and insights. And please remember that we also love your feedback. If you have any questions that you would love us to answer, any topics you would love us to talk about, then you can always reach out and let us know so we can consider it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie, for being here.
Thanks, Alice.
Thank you for listening to the Shift Within podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe for more insightful conversations. Keep asking, keep understanding, keep shifting within, and see you next time in the next episode.